Hello, everybody, and I'm very pleased to welcome Chad Davies of the Scientific Odyssey podcast, translating and the talk is going to be about translating science, a discussion of how scientific ideas are transmitted across space and time, which sounds fascinating. Just a very small thing on admin is that there's a chat window on the right of your screen, which is where you can say nice things and hello and that sort of thing. If you have some specific questions for Chad for the Q&A session at the end, along the bottom, there's bottom of the screen, there's something called Ask a Question. And if you could put your questions in there, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And here's Chad.
Well, Luke, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who have taken the time to sit in here and chat a little bit about how we get to today from the past and how we get scientific ideas across from one culture to the other. I'm going to try to share my screen here as best I can. And hopefully that'll work. I've got a PowerPoint with just a few comments. If it doesn't work, you just get to watch me talk a little bit as we go forward here. And I look forward very much to your interactions as we go along. So please feel free to jump in and ask questions. And we'll see if we can get those answers. I think this is really fantastic if we can do this as a conversation. So here we go. Let's see if I can get my screen to share and go from there. So my name is Chad Davies, of course. I am the producer and host of the Scientific Odyssey podcast. And I want to talk a little bit about the idea of translating science here and looking at what I call the hidden voices of those who transmit scientific knowledge across cultures. And how incredibly important that has been for looking at the history of science and the development of scientific ideas as we go along. And I'd like to look at three specific instances of that in the Western tradition, and to talk a little bit about the characteristics of those transitions and maybe how that informs us going forward. So some things from behind the scenes. When we talk about scientific knowledge in whatever form you want to call that, whether that's practical scientific knowledge, as I mentioned in a roundtable I did a little earlier, what Aristotle might have called techne, or episteme, which is kind of that more theoretical knowledge. That information, that knowledge is created in a place and a time and is part of a specific culture. It arises out of the types of questions that culture asks and the ways in which that culture seeks to answer those questions, whether that be a culture in terms of a civilization or a culture in terms of a scientific discipline. But the thing that's important to understand is that knowledge is almost never constrained to that specific environment and that specific factor for very long. And so we have to talk about how that information gets transmitted out from within that culture to other cultures outside of it. When we look at history, we oftentimes tend to focus on the process of creation and application of that knowledge, but we rarely, I think, really recognize the process through which that knowledge gets transmitted and by whom. Who does that transmission? How does it take place? How does it work? And what are the factors that are necessary and required for that process of transmission to be successful? And it's so we tend to take it for granted. We just sort of say, oh, well, the information got to us, right? When we talk about, and one of the examples I'll talk about is the Einstein's general theory of relativity. But we just take it for granted. Well, Einstein did the work and then kind of everybody knew, but that's not how it happened at all. And that process was fraught in many cases or in many ways. And that knowledge, it didn't just appear, it gets transmitted and translated and questioned and a whole number of other things. And so that's kind of the focus of our discussion this morning. So when we talk about this process of translation, the material itself absorbs some of that process. It becomes an important part of the scientific work, and in some ways as important a part of that scientific work as the original observations or research or theoretical frameworks themselves are. And so I want to sort of look at that in three parts if we can here. The first one I want to look at is what's known as the Arabic translation movement, which some of you may be familiar with. As the classical world wanes and scholarship in the sciences becomes de-emphasized, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, the caliphates that arose from the ashes of the Sassanid Empire in what would have been known as Persia then, when we think of the Middle East now, those civilizations and those cultures wanted to sort of step up on a civilizational level. One of the things that, you sort of see in some of the writings from that time from, either scholars or rulers is that they looked at the Eastern Roman Empire, which would become the Byzantine Empire. They looked to India. They looked to some of the other civilizations around them. And they began to sort of feel like they needed to acquire or obtain the same sort of level of scholarship, of intellectual discourse, of conversation as some of the societies around them. And so what they desired was, let's sit down and let's bring that knowledge from those other cultures into our culture. Let's translate those things. And so there was this incredible translation period, and it begins in what's known as the Umayyad period, which is 7th century, 8th century, and it's this is where this really starts, and it's this movement to acquire and translate scholarly works from a number of cultures into Arabic. Okay, as the Arabic, as the Arabic language expands, as the Islamic culture that goes with that Arabic language expands first through the Middle East and then across North Africa, there's a sense to bring these scholarly works into that broader cultural framework as a way of understanding the world around more completely. And this reaches its height during the period of the Abbasid dynasty. And the big thing to understand is that the thing that you'll oftentimes hear about is what's called the House of Wisdom, or I think probably modern scholarship seems to suggest that there may have been more than one singular individual institution, but rather maybe a network of different homes, of these houses of wisdom. And that really the Al-Mamun is the individual who probably most sort of signifies that desire to move in that direction. And the individuals who were a part of this were often known as Hakim, which is, of course, a person of wisdom is one way to translate that word. But there are, religious implications or overtones to that title, as well as scholarly ones. And so there isn't a clear, necessarily clean translation into, say, English. But what we know is that in Baghdad originally, and then in other great cities such as Cairo, and then, most notably, as we'll talk about later, in Cordoba and Toledo in Spain, what you saw were these institutions of originally translation, and then from that scholarship and research. And these institutions sought to translate and understand works from Greek and Latin scholars, from later Byzantine scholars, from writers in India, and even as far away as China. And among those writings, and they spanned this enormous, incredible range. There were writings, of course, on what would be thought of in the Greek context as natural philosophy. Now, let's talk a little bit about the components. And I didn't want to sort of sit down and get down into the weeds too deeply in looking at the specific individuals, but I wanted to sort of take a top level view on this and talk a little bit about sort of what are the components of this translation movement that are really notable. And the first one, I think, is this incredibly strong support in almost every case from whatever the dominant political entity was. There is a level of, whether you call this governmental or, whatever your religious institutions are, there's strong support both financially and in terms of infrastructure and those sorts of things, in terms of creating institutes, supporting them, and all of that sort of thing to make this happen. In other words, this doesn't just happen with some guys, sitting around in a room saying, gee, we really ought to get some more Aristotle into this culture. This is really much more a case where, you have people in leadership or rulership roles who are saying this needs to happen, this needs to be a part of our culture, and then devoting some fairly significant resources or rewarding those in the elite classes of that society to do that in order to make this happen. So there is strong support. That's a big part of this. Secondly, and I think this is one of the things that's really, really clear about this, is the sense of there has to be a mastery of multiple languages. And in a sense, the thing that goes along with that, of course, is an understanding of the cultures that those languages are associated with, right? So, one of the things that I read in looking at this is that since that region of the world had a number of different languages, even as Arabic becomes sort of the dominant language, there's still a necessity to understand earlier languages, Persian or what have you, that then infuses this ethic into the culture that understanding other cultures and other languages is a requirement, is a necessity, is a foundational part. And so whether that is Hindu, whether that's Latin, whether that's Greek, whatever the case may be, you have the sense that these scholars are going to understand the need to understand how things work in those other languages in order to make that translation. And thus that's going to sort of create an environment where there's this sense of needing to be able to take ideas in other cultures and understand them well enough to explain them in Arabic and Islamic culture. And so that's that idea. Understanding concepts and philosophical ideas through multiple cultural lenses are a big part of this, what we call the Arabic translation movement. This leads to a really important critical evaluation of the source material. This isn't just what you might think of as slavish copying, especially once you get into the Abbasid period. In the sense here, the material that is being examined, that's being translated, that's being brought in, is evaluated critically. It's compared to other material. It's thought about, and then the big thing is there is a synthesis, an extension, and an expansion of the ideas that are brought in. This is not a static process. This isn't a copying of one library into another library, which I think sometimes you get that sense from some of the discussion. This is really a dynamic process that's going to lead to all kinds of things that we'll talk about here in just a moment in terms of what happens in that Arabic Islamic society, even as the caliphate, the political entity, which starts out as a unified political entity, will fragment over time. There is still this sense of this shared sort of culture of ideas. And finally, the other thing that you see a lot, and this is especially true when you get into Andalusia or modern day Spain, is the sense of the need for commentary. In other words, if you have a translation of Aristotle that makes it into Arabic, then there is this idea that it's not just enough to have the work itself or the extension of that work, but then there's also ongoing commentary that's going to be, vitally important to the continuing discussion of that. And so what you've got is both preservation of the material, but also extension of it that's really going to move science forward, or what we might think of as natural philosophy forward. So as part of this movement, what you see is Greek and Indian works on the nature of matter become what's called then alchemy, which basically means the black earth. Alchemy, that's going to eventually become chemistry, right? The idea that you're going to take these works from, whether it's Democritus or Plato or Aristotle or, Indian philosophers who are writing about the nature of matter at roughly the same time, That all gets incorporated, and you're going to get somebody like Al-Jabir, who's going to sit down and begin to develop and extend those ideas by expanding on Aristotle's ideas of four elements, by adding metals and those sorts of things. That's going to be a big part of this. You get these Hellenistic advances in astronomy that are made during the second and third century of the Hellenistic or Greco-Roman period, and those are going to be are preserved via translations and then extensions of that astronomical work. And in Islam, of course, it's so important to be able to determine direction and time, and those are very much the purview of astronomy. And that becomes a really, really important place wherein a lot of incredible work is done, both in translation and extension. Medical knowledge from Galen and Hippocrates are going to be extended, and as well as, geometry and trigonometry. Those get supplemented by the invention of, Al-Jabir is the term, but it's algebra, right? What we think of as algebraic notation is invented during this period as an extension of what's going on. And all of this is transmitted across the Islamic world at a time when what we might think of as Europe has basically lost almost everything through what one author I read said called the narrow neck of the hourglass. That's sort of that fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then all of the things that follow that. And that turns out to be really important that this gets translated, because it gets preserved there in a form that even in the Eastern Empire you don't quite see. Right. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the information's there, but it becomes significantly de-emphasized. Whereas once you get into these Islamic cultures, that doesn't remain static. It doesn't get, sort of buried in a library somewhere. It remains an active source of work and research. And probably the most important part of this, and I can't emphasize this enough, is even with all of the pieces of knowledge that you have that I've just listed, the intellectual practice of empiricism gets preserved. And that's something that's lost almost completely in what we would think of as the West or in Europe, but also in the Byzantine sense. While empiricism will, of course, always survive through the idea of practical science, there is, an emphasis on Plato's work, and that idea of forms and how that sort of matches up well with Christian theology through this period. And so the ideas of Aristotle and empiricism are lost in many ways in what we would think of those parts of Europe and Asia that are dominated by sort of the remnants of the old Roman Empire. It is in this Islamic translation, or this Arabic translation movement, that you see that practice of empiricism preserved, and you begin to see the first really truly systematic approaches to inquiry into the nature of the physical world. What we might call, and I in some sense I really hesitate to use this term because it does cause issues, but what we might call inquiry into the nature of the physical world in terms of a scientific method that's going to become important. The second movement I really want to talk about is the 12th century Latin translation movement. We talked about in medieval Europe, the situation isn't as rosy as you have, say, in the Middle East. Very little makes it through, and it's limited mostly to the writings of Plato and the early church fathers. There isn't a lot of what we would think of as good science. And that's going to be the case for quite a long time. But with the conquest of Toledo in Andalusia or Spain in 1085 and in Sicily in 1091, and the fact that those conquests do not happen with what we might call rampant destruction of either of those two cities. They're not sacked and burned in a sense. Their libraries are preserved, as are the works in those libraries. All of a sudden, these long lost works, and some works that aren't so long lost, but in fact are, let's say, commentaries on these long lost works, are rediscovered, albeit in Arabic, right? And so you have to have another translation movement now, this time from Arabic back into what we would think of as medieval Latin. This sets off a new translation movement, of course, and it's going to profoundly change the course of the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe. This is going to be the high medieval period in Europe, obviously, and you're going to see this happen, and it's going to turbocharge a movement that I think that's really important. As before, there are many of the same characteristics of this translation movement that you saw previously. That idea of having to understand multiple languages, having to understand multiple cultures, having to have some level of state or church support in this case, a desire to, in Europe, they have to do so much catching up that it's going to be quite some time before there's an extension of that material. But all of these same sorts of things take place during this 12th century Latin translation movement. And what happens is, that's really interesting in the case of the 12th century translation movement, is that because you already have a dominant cultural framework through the Catholic Church and the writings of the Catholic Church and the theology that's sort of encapsulated there, as these translations from Arabic of Aristotle and the commentaries on Aristotle make their way back into Europe, it creates a fairly enormous amount of tension in that culture, because you have things that, Aristotle says, things that are different, than what the Catholic Church teaches. And so that has to get resolved. Those tensions have to be worked out. And so, you see this, even as late as the, 1290s, when you get the condemnations of Paris and those sorts of things, where this sense of how do you work this out? And what's going to happen is, this is going to help create and foster that really strong dialectic tradition in the rising European universities. It's going to be so incredibly important as you go forward from this point. That idea of people beginning to critically debate these ideas of having arguments, one person taking one position, one person taking another position, and knowledge advancing in those ways, that's going to be really important up through the period of the plague. And as you come out of the great mortality on the other side in the 15th century, that's going to establish, one of the institutions that really comes through that very well are these universities. Whereas many of the political and, what we might call ecclesial institutions are severely damaged in terms of their prestige or the level of trust. What you find is that these universities tend to weather this better because they are able to provide a process of inquiry. And that's going to be super important when you come out on the other side of the great mortality and into the Renaissance. These are the places that are going to have the tools that are going to be able to move Europe forward so strongly. The final example that I'd like to use as a translation in a modern context is actually one from the 20th century. And this is this idea that in 1915 in Germany, the theoretical physics community is kind of in a race to generalize Einstein's special theory of relativity. Einstein, of course, had published that in 1905 with some additional, sort of forays tentatively in 1907 and 1908. But there was this drive to generalize the special theory of relativity that both Einstein but others as well were working on. The problem, of course, that you run into is that there's this state of embargo that's really happening. While early in the war, there were some efforts to try to keep science in Europe as a fairly international affair. That didn't last very long. And so by 1915, there's almost no communication between what we would think of as the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and what we would think of as the Turkish Empire, with anybody else. And so because of the Great War, that all sort of gets truncated. And so when in around late 1915, early 1916, Einstein completes the general theory. And the thing that's really interesting about that is that that's done in a sense when in a competitive environment with mathematicians such as David Hilbert. that work stays sort of shrouded in mystery for a time. It's not accessible outside of Germany because those German journals that Einstein and Hilbert and others are publishing in, those aren't making it out of Germany. Nothing's making it out of Germany very far. But it's going to turn out that a Dutch astrophysicist by the name of Willem de Sitter is basically able to get copies of the paper, and because of his relationship with the president of the Royal Astronomical Society at the time, or Arthur Eddington, is able to get those papers translated and published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society. And that's going to be important in that information is going to make it out. But then the thing that's really interesting here is that Eddington himself is one of the few astrophysicists who has the mathematical ability to understand Einstein's use of tensor mathematics and some of the other things, and thus translate the work from that very technical theoretical physics context into terms that the astronomical community would be able to understand. And that's going to be really, really important. And again, what you have to sort of see here is, of course, you have some of the same sorts of things. The Royal Astronomical Society, you've got an organization that's willing to spend resources, that is willing to sort of keep a level of scientific communication going and that sort of thing. But there's also some personal things that are going on here in terms of some shared values that I think you see. One of those shared values is Eddington's willing to do this is because the fact that both he and Einstein have similar shared values in terms of both pacifism and internationalism. Einstein's background in those come from his pre-university education in the Canton system in Switzerland, whereas Eddington's commitment to those values comes from his deep Quaker faith. And it turns out that, Eddington is not going to sit down and say, well, gee, Einstein's this German guy and all Germans are terrible because we're at war with them, and so we're not going to pay attention. Einstein, both Eddington and Einstein, who are familiar with each other and share those values, are, Eddington specifically in this context initially, and then both later on, are able to bridge those things that separate and divide them. And so these shared values lead Eddington to look past the ongoing strife and look at the grand accomplishment of Einstein's work and thus promote it to a broader and much more skeptical community. One of the things, nowadays, we just sort of look at Einstein's work and we say, well, yeah, this is all great. At the time, Einstein's work, beginning in 1905 and then through this period and even beyond, there was a lot of skepticism about Einstein's work because of the underlying philosophical tenets of relativity, that space is not absolute, that time's not absolute, that there's this thing called space-time. And there was a great deal of skepticism that in many cases also was tied to the fact that Einstein was Jewish, and there was a lot of suspicion based on that. And yet for Eddington to come out in such great support of Einstein's work is really important. He's able, of course, to sort of get additional government support that's going to lead him to go on and provide the first, what we think of as new observational evidence, right? There was already some observational evidence that Einstein had accounted for it within looking at the orbit of the planet Mercury. But the observational evidence that Einstein will collect by looking at the deflection of starlight around the sun during the solar eclipse there in 1919, that first observational evidence is going to be profoundly important for seeing Einstein's work accepted. That translation of Einstein's work, both in terms of from German into English, but also that translation of highly technical mathematical framework into ideas that could be better understood by the broader scientific community, turned out to be super, super important. So I think some lessons for today, as I sort of wrap this up, and then we can maybe get into some question and answer sorts of things, is science is often inaccessible to what I call the educated non-specialist. And it's as inaccessible today sometimes as it was to those in different cultures of the past, whether that's, work in modern particle physics and discovery of the Higgs boson, or in microbiology and virology, as we're trying to understand the world that we now live in because of the disruption caused by the present pandemic. oftentimes, even those who are educated non-specialists are going to struggle if the scientific knowledge isn't translated out of the jargon of its time. For that gap to be bridged, I think there have to be the same principles that we've already talked a little bit about that have to be embraced by those both doing the science and those seeking to translate that science, right? There has to be institutional support. There has to be a desire to not just transmit the information, but to, understand it in both the culture of the science and the culture of the layperson, and then also the idea that it needs to be extended and expanded. And so in this way, the specialist language that's often used within scientific discourse has to be carefully translated to forms that are understandable without the loss of, richness and nuance, the importance that words in science have specific meanings. And you can't just substitute a different word for those. But if you're going to use that word in that context, that word maybe needs to be defined and explained so that somebody who's not familiar with all of that can understand it. And so that requires, I think, scientists to be fluent in forms of inquiry beyond their own. In other words, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to do scientific inquiry and I don't have to worry about anything else. I think it's important to be, really aware of other forms of inquiry, whether those be philosophical forms of inquiry, historical, literary, whatever the case may be. And it's also, I think, important for those in the field of science communication, especially if they're not from a scientific background, so storytellers, journalists, sometimes popularizers of science, they have to work to develop an understanding of both how scientific inquiry works and then the foundational tenets of the discipline they wish to translate. And so I think with that, it's a good spot maybe for us to get back to some questions and answers. So is there anything we want to chat about?
There are a couple of questions that have been, we've only got about 8 minutes left, and there's some pretty fairly deep questions here, but here's one from Royfield, and he asks, was the intellectual rigor lost in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Roman Empire because of the strength of the Orthodox Church? I suppose that's
Roy,
people say that about Islam and the power of Islam sort of stifled.
Right. And so I think, I think the thing that's really interesting is I'm not so sure I would say it's the strength of the Orthodox Church in and of itself, Royfield. And that's a fantastic question. I think it actually comes back to this idea that there is a cultural commitment to Platonism. And some of the philosophical foundations of Platonism de-emphasize what we learn through our senses. They de-emphasize empiricism. Well, once you begin to de-emphasize that, if you have a method of inquiry that's entirely based on that, then that method of inquiry also gets lost. Now, the sense of intellectual rigor being lost, I think there's a great deal of intellectual rigor in the Eastern Roman Empire towards maybe what we call practical matters, right? In the ideas of law, in engineering, in those sorts of things. You really do see that for a very long period of time. But yeah, when you talk specifically about scientific inquiry, I think it has as much to do with your broad cultural philosophical assumptions more than the specific strength of an institution, as long as you understand that institution is, of course, reinforcing those values within the culture.
Thank you. Another question is, were there ever efforts in the 12th century to find original Greek to compare with the Arabic translations found in Spain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing that comes out is we get sources both out of Spain and out of Sicily, and there are some efforts to find Greek texts. But one of the things, and I haven't been able to track this down as much as I would like to, is it does seem that those Arabic translations really hold a lot of sway until about the time of the fall of Constantinople. Right. And it's, as that's happening in, 1485. And you get a huge number of Greek works that are then going to make their way to Italy and really, really fire up the Italian Renaissance. That's when you begin to see those comparisons taking place in much greater form. And that's one of the things I'm not sure I fully understand why there isn't more before that period. As I've tried to look and find that, what I keep finding is that a lot of people just talk about translations of Arabic works, and that there doesn't seem to be a lot of intellectual cross-pollination from the Byzantine Empire back to these kingdoms in Western Europe.
Great, and just one last question, this is quite a big one. I found myself totally out of depth with some Byzantine scholars who were arguing the House of Wisdom and the Arabic translation is overrated as a concept. They considered the central repository of this knowledge was Byzantium simultaneously with House of Wisdom concepts. Would you care to comment?
I think the thing is it's maybe an issue of dynamism, right? And again, I think that my response to the earlier question is probably relevant here. In the Eastern Empire, I think the knowledge is there, the repositories are, the books are in libraries, but they're not really being used much. They're just sort of thought of as just chunks of information. They're relics of the past, and because empiricism is so de-emphasized, it's just they're not considered all that valuable other than as historical artifacts. Whereas when you get to Baghdad, later Cairo, into Spain, this is dynamic information. These are people who are still valuing empiricism. They're still valuing information gathered by their senses, trying to understand the natural world, developing methods of scientific inquiry or processes of scientific inquiry that are dynamic, that are going to become really, really important as that gets translated back into Europe. If you look at, say, somebody like Grosseteste or Roger Bacon's work in England at Oxford, it's very, very clear, at least Bacon, but probably Grosseteste later as well. They're picking up on that dynamism that's in those Arabic documents that are translated back into Latin. And I think that's probably, what I would say now. In terms of a specific House of Wisdom, I'm not, I think that's probably something, that idea is probably something, that's influenced by sort of a Library of Alexandria concept, that there was a specific place that was state sponsored and supported, the great museum, the whole bit. It's not clear that you had something like that. And unfortunately, we just don't have good evidence, because all of that was destroyed in the conquests by the Mongols, that sort of raised Baghdad. By then, you have other places where that information is shifted. We certainly know in Cairo that was done. There was a specific institution in Cairo, at least for a time. But you see in Spain this sort of distributed network of centers of learning, something that's much more like what you'll see in medieval and later Europe, with this idea of universities, where you have distributed centers of scholarly work that then are involved in some level of communication.
Great, that's fantastic. A couple of other things, but I think we should probably start wrapping up. Yes, well, thank you very much, Chad. I think that was a fascinating talk, and I'm sure everyone seems to have enjoyed it very much. I think you also wanted me to thank everyone for attending your talk, so I'll pass that on your behalf.
Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say and to be a part of this. It's been fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you.